Hello, I'm Pete Fryer. I'm the chair of the Heathrow Branch of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Once again tonight, we're attempting to deliver a hybrid lecture. That means it's face-to-face. We've got the lecturer here, we've got an audience here, and we've got everyone at home watching us on their, whatever they're watching us on, telephone, computer, television, whatever. To all of you, I'm going to wish you a very big welcome to the Heathrow branch of the Royal Aeronautical Society. It's great to see so many people in the audience. This evening, we have a very special branch event. It's staged to celebrate the month of the coronation of King Charles III. The Royal Aeronautical Society Heathrow branch is highly delighted to welcome Squadron Leader Graham Laurie as our guest speaker tonight. Graham joined the RAF as a pilot in 1964. He flew for 36 years, amassing a total of 13,500 flying hours. And during the last 20 years of that career, he flew members of the royal family and senior government ministers all over the world. In 1981, as I said, he was selected to serve in the Queen's flight. And in 1995, after that unit's disbandment, he moved seamlessly to number 32, the Royal Squadron, as it became known. Graham is secretary of the Chiltern Aircrew Association and was for 40 years a soccer referee. He lives in Buckinghamshire with his wife Jo. Hello, Jo's with us tonight. Hello, Jo. And he has 2 grown-up children. In 2011, both he and Jo were made ambassadors of the RAF Benevolent Fund. I see you've got your badge on tonight. So that was for fundraising efforts where Graham talks and Jo sells her Christmas card designs to the fund. Tonight's lecture, The History of Royal Flying, is an informal illustrated talk covering the early days of royal flying, the formation of the King's Flight in June 1936, the renaming of as the Queen's Flight in 1953, the merger of Communication Squadron assets into 32, the Royal Squadron, in May 1966, and it brings that history up to date to the present day, all woven together with many of Graham's absolutely fascinating personal reminiscences. To our audience today, if you have any questions for Graham, if you're watching online, your microphone will be muted throughout the presentation. I encourage you to pose the questions through the Q&A window, which can be opened from the question mark button of Teams. You can also interact with us by clicking the thumbs up or like button next to each question that has been published. After the lecture, we'll pose your questions to Graham on your behalf. If you're in the audience with me tonight, please wait till after the lecture. Raise your hand when you want to speak, but speak up loud so everyone at home has some chance of hearing you. When we're ready for you, we'll point to you, we'll ask you to give your question directly to Graham. If you want a certificate of attendance for your continuing CPD, let us know. Please use the Q&A panel to inform us of your name, and we'll email that to you afterwards. Finally, I'd like to make you aware that today's session is being recorded, so it'll be available online after the event. I'm going to pass you over to Graham. Graham, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I wish you all success in giving your presentation.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to our branch.
Thank you. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both here in the room and at home. I don't think I really need to introduce myself. I listened to that and I couldn't believe. There was just one change, I think, from what you said. We merged in 1995 when we went to 32. But seamlessly, it says in your write-up. That's not the words I use in here, but we'll come to that later.
Yeah.
But I think I'll go straight into it then. And royal flying, actually, we go back to the First World War because the then Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, flew 3 times during the First World War. He was actually a guards officer, but he flew twice during the over France, over the battlefields, and once in Italy. His brother Prince Albert also flew during the war with the Royal Naval Air Service at Royal Naval Air Station Sleaford, which we know, of course, today as Royal Air Force Cranwell. And after the war, it was Prince Albert who learnt to fly first. He flew from Croydon Aerodrome, and in those days it was actually called Wotton Airfield, but it expanded later to Croydon Aerodrome. And you see him here talking to his instructor before one of his sorties. And in 1919, he was gazetted in the London Gazette as a squadron leader in the Royal Air Force and was awarded his RAF wings. But probably the keener of the two brothers was the Prince of Wales. And he again took himself off to Hounslow Aerodrome, not that far from where we are tonight. And he took along some members of King George V's household to watch him fly with one of the pilots who'd flown him during the First World War. And they took off in the Sopwith Dove, did some aerobatics in the overhead, and then came down and did a series of landings and takeoffs. And eventually they, after about 40 minutes, taxied back into dispersal. And there he is talking to Major Barker, VC, who was his pilot, Canadian VC. And on one particular day during the First World War, he flew 5 sorties. On the first sortie, he took a bullet through the knee, but carried on. And on the 5th sortie, he took a bullet through the elbow, which actually shattered his elbow joint. And if you look carefully, he's actually taking his arm out of a sling, and he operated the throttle with the crook of his elbow like this. That story got back to King George V the next day, and he immediately banned both his sons from flying. He said, if that sort of thing's going on, it's far too dangerous. And it was actually quite a long wait until eventually, after a lot of pressure from the Prince of Wales, the King agreed that the Royal Air Force could fly him to one of his engagements. And the first one was in 1928 to the Norfolk and Norwich Aero Club. And I think the thing with this photo is a huge crowd. Of course, not only was the Prince of Wales very popular, people were still turning up just to see aircraft fly in those days. But there was one slight problem for the Prince. To fly with the Royal Air Force, he had to dress up in the flying kit of the day. And I think you'll agree that's not really conducive to going on a royal visit. So he had to think about it. And the next thing was, could he buy his own aircraft? The King said no, but he kept trying and kept trying. And eventually the King agreed he could buy a de Havilland Gypsy Moth, which he did. And when he went flying, he just wore an Irving jacket over his suit. So when he landed, he stood up, took the Irving jacket off, put it on the seat, the rear seat, and stepped off. And of course, there was only one thing missing, which was then the hat was handed to him by a flunky on arrival. After flying that aircraft, or having been flown in that aircraft, he asked the King if he could learn to fly. No, said the King, it's far too dangerous. But eventually he had a lot of pressure put on him, and eventually he agreed. And he said, if you can be taught to fly by the Royal Air Force and they consider you fit to go solo, you can do the one solo flight. And thereafter, you must always have an RAF pilot with you. And this he agreed. And immediately after he did his first solo on the 17th of November 1929 at RAF Norfolk, he was told by his instructor that he really ought to get a personal pilot, because this guy had a full RAF career and he couldn't really take up the time. The Prince of Wales was very, very keen at that stage. So they got a recently retired RAF flight lieutenant called Mouse Fielden to take over, and he looked after his aircraft, the engineering and the bookings. And almost the first thing he did was move the aircraft from the hangar at RAF Norfolk to Royal Air Force Hendon. And the next thing he did was order a larger aircraft, because the Prince really needed to have his private secretary as a minimum with him whenever he flew. So they got a de Havilland Puss Moth. And just to show you how keen he is, the Puss Moth, he was doing a tour to South America. So they took the wings off the Puss Moth, put the aircraft and the wings on HMS Eagle, the aircraft carrier, and it sailed out to South America. They reassembled it on the land, not on the boat, and he used it during that tour on 2 or 3 occasions. And also, while he was out there, he became the first member of the royal family to land on an aircraft carrier when he sat in the Fairy 3 that was based on board and landed one evening after an engagement. If he was back in the UK, if he was visiting an RAF airfield, then the Royal Air Force would fly him in. So you see him here at Royal Air Force Andover in Hampshire in 1931, wearing the flying suit of the day because he was visiting squadrons on exercise. Every time de Havilland introduced a new aircraft, Fielden was there at the beginning and asking for a larger aircraft. So the next one was the Foxmoth. So Fielden sat in the cockpit on the top, and it meant the Prince could invite guests on board and fly with him in the Foxmoth. Now, we're talking now the early 1930s. So, of course, as well as the Prince flying, other people were starting to fly, and we were starting to get the airliners going into Europe. And Vickers asks the Prince to help design the interior fit of the Vickers V Astra. And here you see him at Brooklands meeting the managing director, and the gentleman getting out of the aircraft on the right-hand side is actually Edward Fielden, who's obviously just flown him in. And the interior that he came up with was very luxurious with laminated wood. It really did look beautiful, and it was very popular. Now, here's a picture of 3 kings, if you think about it. King George V in the middle, the future King Edward VIII on his right, and on his left, the future King George VI. Now, I mentioned both his sons flew and got their wings, but during his lifetime, King George V nor Queen Mary flew. So what's he doing wearing RAF wings? Well, the story goes this time, it was pressure on the Air Ministry, not from the King, but from the Prince of Wales to award him honorary wings for all the pressure that the King had been put on. The other story goes that, well, it was his Air Force. But in fact, I believe the story that the Prince of Wales' pressure on the Air Ministry was the reason it was given. That picture was actually taken on one of his, it was July the 6th, 1935, and was it 36? We need these now at my age. 1935, I was right. But that morning it was taken in the grounds of Buckingham Palace, but in the afternoon they went to Royal Air Force Mildenhall and the King reviewed the Royal Air Force. Now, the aircraft the Prince had at this time was the de Havilland Dragon Rapide. And I'd like you to look at those colours, because those are the colours of the Brigade of Guards. And he painted all his aircraft, he had them painted in those colours. It became famous also because it was the first aircraft to fly a British monarch. The day after King George V died, King Edward VIII flew from Bircham Newton, a little airstrip near Sandringham, down to Hendon to attend his succession council. And immediately he became king. He asked the Air Ministry 2 questions. One, would they fund the operation of his aircraft? And secondly, would they form an official royal flight? So the King's flight was formed on the 21st of July, 1936. And its commanding officer, or captain of the King's flight, as he was known, was a newly promoted and brought back into the Royal Air Force Wing Commander Edward Fielden, Mouse Fielden. And so during that 1936, there is King Edward VIII getting out of the Dragon Rapide at Royal Air Force Mildenhall when he was reviewing the Royal Air Force. Now, inside the Dragon Rapide, it's had beautiful red leather seats, and you can see still the Prince of Wales feathers on the back of those seats. It was a very comfortable and practical aircraft. But during that year, of course, towards the end of the year, we had the abdication, and we had something that could only happen in Britain. We had a King's flight. We had a king who was Edward VIII for a little while, but when he left, we still had the captain of the King's flight, Edward Fielden, but what they didn't have was an aircraft, because when he left, he took his Dragon Rapide with him. So the first thing that Fielden had to do for the new king was find an aircraft and find it pretty quickly. Well, luckily for him, the Airspeed Company of Portsmouth were just bringing out the Airspeed Envoy, and that became the first publicly funded aircraft for the King's flight. And it flew right up until the outbreak of the Second World War. There's the King getting out of the aircraft at RAF Cranwell. Now, in September of 1939, the Air Ministry decided that Hendon was too close to the centre of London, so they wanted the King's flight to move. Fielden wanted to go to Smith's Lawn at Windsor Castle, not as silly as it seemed, because that was used as a landing ground for light aircraft throughout the 30s. But the Air Ministry said, no, it's got to be a proper RAF station with full security. So they moved to Royal Air Force Benson near Wallingford in Oxfordshire. The other thing they did was find a new aircraft for the King to fly in because they needed it to be armed. And unfortunately, there was no practical way of arming the Envoy. So after a selection procedure, they came up with the Lockheed Hudson, the long-range version. It had 2 gun emplacements, one in the nose, one in the tail. Fielden flew in the left-hand seat, he put another engineer in the right, and an RAF engineer manned the guns in the front. But when it came to the guns in the rear, the royal household would not allow an RAF engineer into the royal cabin. I think they thought he might have dirty fingernails. At any rate, the answer eventually came that it was going to be the steward who would be trained to man those guns. They were never fired in anger, and I think it's probably just as well when I tell you the steward was actually a footman from Buckingham Palace. He wasn't a military man at all. But the aircraft was used by other members of the royal family. That's the Duke of Kent getting out of the aircraft. Of course, a few months later, sadly, he was killed in that famous Sunderland flying boat accident. And in fact, on the 14th of February 1942, the King's flight was disbanded for the remainder of the war. And Fielden took the personnel and the aircraft to join 161 Squadron at Newmarket, where he became the squadron commander. And after the first year, the heavier aircraft, the Halifaxes, etc., that they were using. Of course, 161 was the squadron that dropped the SOE operatives into France under moonlight. And they were getting bogged down, the heavier aircraft. So they moved to Royal Air Force Tempsford, also in Cambridge, which had a concrete runway. And Fielden became the station commander, but he continued to fly with 161. And there he is in the middle with some of the crew. And he had a very successful wartime career. And in fact, in 1943, he was awarded the DFC for his efforts. After the war, the King's flight was reformed at Benson on the 1st of May 1946. And again, there were a couple of changes. First of all, Fielden was getting on in years now, and he decided he would no longer fly the aircraft. He would stay as captain of the King's flight and do all the administration with the royal households, the bookings and so forth. But he got a New Zealand wing commander, Bill Taken, in to become the senior pilot. And the aircraft they bought was the same as BEA had bought, the Vickers Viking. And they ordered 2. But soon after, there was a meeting of the royal households, and it became clear that 2 wasn't enough, because the King wanted to take his family to South Africa in early 1947. So poor old BEA, who were operating Vikings and still had some on order, had 2 of them pinched by the Air Ministry, and they were pushed down to the bottom of the line. And the RAF, the King's flight, had 4 Vikings. And here's 3 of the 4 on the tarmac at Bloemfontein during that South African tour. The first one carried the King and Princess Margaret. The second one, Her Majesty the Queen and Princess Elizabeth. Now, of course, that's because the King could not fly with Princess Elizabeth. The same if we bring it right forward to today, the King cannot fly with the Prince of Wales, because they never fly with the next one in line to the throne. The only time that was changed, and it was during my time, until William became 12 years of age, they allowed the Prince and Princess of Wales to fly with both children on the summer holidays, but only with the express written permission of Her Majesty. The third aircraft carried the ground crew, and the fourth one was flown by this chap. Now, we know him better as a Concorde pilot, but he was actually a Viking pilot with the King's flight back in 1947. Now there's the cockpit of the Viking, nothing VIP about that at all, just exactly the same as everybody else's. And down the back, two very comfortable seats. The telephone only went to the front of the aircraft to speak to either the captain of the King's Flight or the steward. And of course, the Viking was still in service when the King died and the unit became the Queen's Flight on the 6th of February 1952. But of course, her first flight was not with the Queen's Flight, it was with BOAC coming back in the Argonaut to Heathrow to be met by her government. As soon as they got going, Her Majesty and Prince Philip were busy flying in the Vikings, and Prince Philip himself used it for his own engagements. And in fact, after she was crowned in 1953, in June, he announced he'd like to learn to fly. So they brought two chipmunks in from storage and did a few minor modifications, and then almost on a daily basis they flew the aircraft from Benson to RAF White Waltham, where the Prince did most of his training. The reason being, of course, in those days there was no M4, and therefore to drive out to Oxford was actually going to take far too long, particularly if he was coming from London. So he did most of his training at White Waltham, went on after flying the Chipmunk to fly the Harvard, so a more powerful single-engined aircraft. He then did some twin-engine training in the Dove, and then the Royal Navy loaned him one of their de Havilland Herons, and he started to fly himself to his own engagements with a Queen's Flight captain in the right-hand seat, something he continued to do until he was 75 years old. The Chipmunks came back into service in 1970 when the Prince of Wales wanted to learn to fly. And I've been showing this picture for many, many years now. And I was asked at a WI by an old lady one day, what's that pigeon doing on the top? Well, it isn't a pigeon, as you could probably guess. There's a more up-to-date picture of it. It was the Grime site that they fitted. It was one of the modifications they'd done to make the aircraft look more visible. Now, the Prince of Wales, after learning to fly on the Chipmunk, moved in 1971 to Royal Air Force Cranwell, and he did a full wings course, taking 9 months on the Jet Provost T5. He then went on and did some twin-engine training in the Beagle Bassett before starting to fly with the Queen's Flight. Other royal pilots, there's Prince Andrew learning to fly a glider in the early days while he was still at Gordonston. And of course, Prince William got his wings after a much shorter course at Cranwell, presented by his father, before he became initially a co-pilot and later a captain on the search and rescue helicopters at Valley. And after his 3 years in the Royal Air Force, he gained his civilian licenses and worked for 2 years with the East Anglian Ambulance Service and flying their helicopters. And I'm told people were trying to break their legs and falling off the curbs and things with the hope that he would come and pick them up. And then, of course, there was another pilot, this time with the Army Air Corps, which his father was the commandant. And there is Harry getting his wings from his father. Now, going back to the history, the Vikings were eventually replaced. Fielden wanted to make it the Vickers Viscount, the same as BEA had done, but the dreaded accountants said, no, that's too expensive. So they had to have the de Havilland Heron, much to the delight, of course, of the Duke of Edinburgh, because he was already current on that aircraft. The problem was it needed refueling more often than the Viking. Its range wasn't as big as the Viking. It was still unpressurized. Okay, inside it looked very nice. The seats were comfortable. There was a nice big table to either eat or work at. Huge windows, of course, because it was unpressurized. There wasn't any room in the cockpit for the navigator, and yet they wanted to operate it around the world. So he sat in the front starboard seat of the passenger cabin, and they did operate it around the world. This picture was taken at Enugu in Nigeria when Her Majesty and Prince Philip were visiting. Later on that same tour, they moved to Ghana, and they did a trip from Accra to a strip-up country, which took an hour. After half an hour, they measured the temperature on board, and it was 125 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can imagine Her Majesty trying to get out looking neat and tidy. So really, as soon as the Heron came into service, they started looking for a replacement. It came in 1964 in the form of the Avro 748, or the RAF Andover Mark II, as it was known. Only in the Royal Air Force could the Mark II come into service 2 years before the Mark I, but let's not go there. We had two delivered in 1964, and they kept one Heron until the third Andover came online in 1967. And here's a picture of the Andover landing with Her Majesty on board, in fact, at a strip in Ethiopia called Dugti. A couple of things I want you to notice. One, the two standards on the top of the aircraft. I'll talk about those a little bit later. And the second is how clean and shiny the underside of the fuselage, the engine nacelles, the propellers are. And when I say clean, I mean clean, as you can see here. The problem was, though, the engineers were polishing that aluminium so hard to keep it clean, they were polishing the rivets out, which, as you can see, were put in by Avro at Woodford by the thousands, or in fact millions, I think. At any rate, it really was causing an engineering problem, but it was solved by the ICI paint division at Slough, who were just introducing polyurethane paint. And so this colour scheme became the standard one from the 1970s. And the RAF cheat line on the back was replaced by the Union flag. And we had that famous red, white and blue colour scheme, which carried on throughout the Andover's life, and then the 146. It was done for flight safety reasons to make it really visible. And then in 2002, they went for a different design because by then security had taken over from flight on the flight safety side, and they wanted it to look like any other aircraft. But I'm going to talk about the 146 a little bit later, but I want to go back and we'll think of Brian Trubshaw, because in 1947, he learned to fly the helicopter as well. Now, I got nothing but admiration from people who can. I've tried, but no way. But they did a trial taking the mail from Aberdeen to Balmoral every day. It was flown up by BEA during the morning, delivered by helicopter. They waited there all day, and then the return mail was taken back to Aberdeen Dice by helicopter, and BEA flew it back to London. And that trial worked very well, and Trubshaw was one of the pilots. But things moved quite slowly, and it wasn't until 1953 when the Central Flying School loaned an aircraft, a helicopter, so that they can actually do some live royal flying. And it was really Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and the Duke of Edinburgh who pushed for the Queen's flight to get their own helicopter. It eventually came in 1958. And it was the Westland Whirlwind, and it revolutionised royal flying. Instead of doing 2 visits in a day, if it was a busy day, they could do 5, because they'd land in a helicopter car park, move on to a school playing field and so forth, and the driving in between was all removed. Sadly, in 1967, while one of them was just after a major servicing, was flying to Westland's factory at Yeovil, where people were going to talk about a replacement helicopter, and sadly it crashed near Newbury, and everyone on board was killed. The captain, then captain of the Queen's flight, the senior engineering officer, and the pilot and navigator. The Whirlwind was then grounded, and they had to wait 18 months before another helicopter came online, and it was the Westland Wessex. And I'll show you a picture of that one going on, that was 1968. And I'll show you another photograph of it going on its very last royal flight while we were at Northolt. And here's Her Majesty getting out of a helicopter for the very first time. It was during her Silver Jubilee, and she spent the night on board the Royal Yacht off the Northern Ireland coast. The Royal Navy put another aircraft next door. The helicopter landed on that. She alighted onto the helicopter and flew into Hillsborough Castle. And the gentleman saluting her there on arrival is the then captain of the Queen's flight, Air Commodore Sir Archie Winskill, who was a Hurricane Battle of Britain pilot based with 32 Squadron at Biggin Hill during the war. A wonderful guy who Her Majesty thought the world of. And he was my first captain when I joined in 1981. He retired at the very end of that year. The big thing about the helicopter, it can pick you up in your back garden if you happen to live at Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, where they did the garden parties. They used to land there. Kensington Palace had a nice grass area outside, and the two out-of-town houses, Gatcombe and Highgrove, were surrounded by their own fields, so there was no problem. There was some talk of getting fixed wing into the centre of London. We used to use Northolt or Heathrow, depending where people lived. If it was Buckingham Palace, they used Heathrow. If it was Kensington Palace or St James's Palace, we used Northolt. But the idea actually didn't eventually catch on. But the idea of using the MAL was really, I was quite excited by it, but it never came to fruition. Someone told me it was because 2 Jags Prescott was going to be driving up and down the Mall every day, but I'm not sure that's true. But the big thing about the helicopter, it can get you to places where you would not be able to get to by any other means. This is the Western Isles of Scotland. You can see what the terrain's like. The only practical area was the beach. The harbour was too small for the Royal Yacht. There were no road and rail links, so the helicopter was ideal. And it really sums up what the Queen's Flight was all about, getting the royal family to the people of Britain and the Commonwealth. And talking of helicopters, as soon as we got them, Prince Philip said he'd like to learn to fly, which he did. And he carried on flying the helicopter till he was 70. But he had to stop then because he had arthritic hands, and twisting and lifting the collective lever he was finding quite difficult. So he carried on fixed wing flying for another 5 years, but stopped his helicopter flying. Inside the passenger cabin of the Wessex was either 5 or 7 seats. There was a balancing act between the distance they wanted to fly and the amount of fuel they were carrying. There was a pilot and navigator up in the cockpit above. The only other member of the crew was a crew chief, and he would bring the steps in, close the door, and, if necessary, serve the food. It would only be a tray of sandwiches or an afternoon tea tray coming back. If it was an evening trip, he took a bar box, and it had a bottle of gin, bottle of whiskey, red wine, white wine, and a bottle of Dubonnet in case the Queen Mum was on board. And someone here has already spotted the tonic water under the seats at the back, and that's where it was kept. Now, here is a helicopter departure from the field. We had a helicopter support squadron who used to drive out in Land Rovers or Range Rovers latterly with fire cover attached on a trailer. And they would lay out the H, and in some cases, they said they have here a footpath for the royal party to walk to as they depart. And the royal, as you can probably see, is the Princess Royal. She's saying goodbye to the Lord Lieutenant, the grey-haired gentleman. Behind him is the Chief Constable, lady-in-waiting with the big fluffy hat, and the captain of the Queen's Flight in those days, Air Vice Marshal Sir John Seven. And the other gentleman is her personal protection officer, Metropolitan Police Sergeant. And he is just disarming his pistol, pulling out the magazine of bullets. He puts them in one pocket, the gun in the other. When they land, he rearms and carries on with his protection duties. Now, that picture I showed you at RAF Morton in Marsh was in 1953. And with the 4 Vikings, they did 60 royal flights. By 1985, with only 1 more aircraft, 3 Andovers and 2 Wessex helicopters, we did 1,200 royal flights. Now, the royal family, if you think at that time, was probably at its largest number of working royals. Princess Alexandra, Duke and Duchess of Kent, Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, and so forth, Princess Alice as well. So there was a lot of people. And but to make that possible, and we had a dispatch reliability of 99.95%. To make it possible, it was our engineers. And I think you'll agree, if you look at the fixed wing end of the hangar or the helicopter end, the thing that stands out is how clean the hangar floor is. Our aircraft developed leaks like any other aircraft, but it was very easy to spot. And the guys would then work on it until it was serviceable. You couldn't say, oh, when is the next aircraft needed? Because when you were doing 1,200 royal flights in the year, basically the answer was tomorrow. for all of the aircraft. So here is one of the engineers inspecting a 146 engine. If it needed changing, it could be done overnight in 4 hours. And the nice thing is those guys are standing on the ground on the hangar floor using the little hoist that British Aerospace designed to get the engine up. Now, the 146, we got the 100 series in 1986. There'd been a lot of talk about 111s and so forth, but eventually they had a competition and they said the aircraft's got to be British. So they had the 146 and then they had the Canadair Challenger, and there was a French aircraft as well. So not surprising, the 146 won the contract. And the big thing was it was probably, and may still be, the quietest 4-engine airliner built. And we got the 100 series because of its very good short field landing performance, because we didn't want to miss out on a lot of the airfields that we could use in the Andover. And in fact, I think it was only Aberporth we couldn't go into out of all the, we went as well as the big international airfields, Heathrow, Manchester, Glasgow. We would use Dundee, Sheffield, Plymouth, Carlisle, those sort of airfields as well. So it was really a very practical aircraft. And that picture was taken at London City because we also got clearance to operate on the steep glide path. The 146 was one of the biggest jets to be allowed to be cleared in there. We had to do special simulator work, and then we were cleared and the aircraft was cleared to go into London City. There's the cockpit of the 146, designed for 2 pilots. We put, we had a navigator on the Andover, and we put a navigator on the jump seat for the early days of the 146 while the crews were familiarising themselves. When we got to 32, after a couple of years, the navigators were removed and it was just a 2-pilot operation. We had inertial nav systems and so forth, so there was no reason, but we did have the Navigators Union thought we'd never be able to do the timing to the standard required, but it was amazing. It worked out very well. The big change with the 146 from the Andover was the galley. Cooking in the Andover was like cooking in a caravan, and that was the easiest way I could explain it. But then we had a full airline galley with blower ovens. In my day, the food always came from British Airways, and it was from our police would drive up to Heathrow. Even if the aircraft was positioning at Heathrow, they'd drive up in the morning to Heathrow. They would check the food, seal the containers, drive them back to Benson, and they'd be put on board. And then the only person to open them would be this one of the stewards. And when we went further afield, we could take about 6 days' food from the BA kitchen and keep it on dry ice in the hold. After that, if we were going, say, to Africa for 2 weeks, as sometimes happened, then we'd look at the major hotel chains, the Hyatt, the Intercontinental, the Sheraton. If we were staying there, that was our excuse for staying at decent hotels, that we needed the catering to be done from there. And but of course, sometimes once you get up country, out, particularly in Africa, you don't find hotels. And so whenever we were flying, normally the Princess Royal, who one of her charities she works for is as president of Save the Children Fund. And of course, they have refugee camps normally on the borders with another country and so forth. So very often for her, we had to take what I call the bottom line in catering. And that was those wonderful little, you can still get them today, the flat tinned meat pies by Fray Bentos, and we'd serve up steak kidney pie or chicken and leek pie with tinned potatoes, tinned vegetables. The stewards would tart up a gravy, bit of bisto, and add a few spices, and we'd serve them hot food like that. Do you know, they used to love it? I think it was such a lovely change from all the fancy first class food that they get everywhere else. Behind the galley is the crew station. In fact, most airlines, because it's first class, but Her Majesty wanted to be at the back. They'd been at the back in the Viking and the Heron, and she wanted, when she saw the Andover was at the back, when she saw the 146, she said, oh, well, the engines will get in the way if I look at the front. I'd like to be at the back. And so the middle cabin, which you see there, had the household staff. It would be her policeman, The private secretary would normally be in the rear, but the ordinary secretaries would be in the middle cabin. There might be a dresser, a baggage master, someone like that. And the secretaries had a little office station. Nowadays, of course, you can just see in the top left-hand corner there an electric typewriter, but of course nowadays it's all laptops and so forth. But the secretaries did a lot of work, both going to and coming back. They started the thank you letters on the way back. There's the royal cabin, 6 seats, in fact, 2 singles and a double. You could remove those double seats and put a bed in, but in practical terms, the seats are, I call them sleeperette seats. They will go back virtually flat, not quite like they now have in business class, but like they used to in the old days in business class. And they were quite comfortable. But the problem was every 4.5 hours, we needed to stop and refuel. So consequently, just as if they went to bed, just as they get off to sleep, we have to tap and, do you mind getting up and sitting in the seat? So most of them decided this was the normal way. And I think I only did 2 trips in all those years with the bed fitted. The first 146 royal flight was the honeymoon of the Duke and Duchess of York. That picture appeared on most of the daily papers the following day, along with this one. Our engineers have been busy in the hangar overnight, putting a big L plate and just married and horseshoes and wedding bells. The captain of the Queen's flight was on board, but he didn't see that, which was probably just as well. He did, in fact, find out on the return trip, because we took all the newspapers out that had been published about the wedding, but no one had complained to him by then. So he sort of saw the funny side of it. Now, the red carpet was the bane of our lives. We always used to say, if you're going to put down a red carpet, it must stop outside the wingtip. Because as you can see, the nacelles on the 146 are quite close to the ground, and it would be quite easy to pull up the ends of the carpet. But what often happened, you could see everybody lined up on the red carpet, and the last few meters were rolled up, and you knew what they were going to try and do, roll it out. But of course, you parked and stopped when the guy crossed his backs, and then you came slowly to a halt. So you were very often a few yards past where they were, and they never understood. They were told the royal will walk to the red carpet. But I was in Lagos one day with over 100 ministers lined up on the red carpet, and the Prince of Wales, he flew in and flew the aircraft. So it was a couple of minutes before he got down the back, put his jacket on and went out. And half of them had sort of shuffled forward. He strode off to the red carpet. So they were sort of shuffling forward, shuffling back. It was utter chaos. How he kept a straight face, I will never know. There is the royal arrival. In this case, it's at Royal Air Force Cranwell. And I mentioned we fly 2 pilots. We had 2 stewards, one to cook and one to serve. And then the crew chief was the engineer. If we went on a longer trip overseas for, say, 5 days or more, we would take 3 extra engineers, so we had full trade cover. The other guy we had on the crew always was the policeman, who's on the left-hand side of the steps there. The gentleman saluting is a deputy captain of the Queen's flight. As you can imagine, once we went up to 1,200 royal flights a day, there was no way the captain could look after all of them. So we had one full-time deputy captain, and this one was, in fact, it was really his secondary duty, because his main duty was station commander at Royal Air Force Benson. And the Royal, you probably won't recognise, it's actually His Majesty the Sultan of Brunei, who was on a state visit, and Her Majesty asked him to cover one of the wings parades at Royal Air Force Cranwell. And in fact, on the return journey to Norfolk, I let him fly the aircraft back, because he already was flying the Airbus, his own Airbus, and his instructor was one of my instructors when I went through advanced training, and he said what a good pilot he was, and he certainly was. Anyway, there, the 146, we had a simulator to do our training in, and we managed to get both the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Edinburgh into the sim on the odd occasion, not as often as we would like, but that was the Prince when he was doing one of his early simulator sorties. We actually had the aircraft delivered a year before the simulator came online, so we had to do all our initial training live. Now, for royal flying, there are 3 buzzwords, really. The first is safety, and that is obviously paramount. The second one is comfort. And we tried to do the thing together, comfort and safety. We'd avoid bad weather and timing at an on-time arrival, plus or minus 5 seconds, which was the gap you saw there. Believe it or not, we made it on over 90% of occasions. And the royal family were very good at getting out on time. Coming home, sometimes they were a little bit late, but if they didn't have an evening engagement, it didn't really matter. But we'll go back and look at safety. Here was the helicopter going out onto a rig in the North Sea for the very first time. And the princess went up to Aberdeen. We flew her to Aberdeen, and normally she would just walk across to the helicopter and climb in. But on this occasion, she had to go to the Bristow's hangar and look at the video that they always have to look at, the oil workers, before they go out, so that they know what to do in the event of the helicopter alighting on water. And she also obviously had to put on an immersion suit. We got 2 days warning of Prince William's first flight, and we sent our engineering officer and adjutant down to Mothercare in Reading and said, come back with a carry cot and a carry cot restraint. In those days, you could put your children sideways on the back seat with a carry cot restraint plugged into the seat belts. So if we'd gone over turbulence over the Pennines, he'd have been quite safe. But as you can see, when they got to Aberdeen, they popped him in their own little bassinet, laid it on the back seat of the Rover and drove off to Balmoral. 2 years or 2.5 years later, he did his first solo flight, and he'd obviously been well briefed to shake hands with the deputy captain at the foot of the steps. Another 2 years on, he had another partner in crime to help him. And Her Majesty is particularly keen to be involved with the people who fly her. And here she is greeting the crew that were going to fly her out on the third 146 when it was delivered in 1990. Well, there is the Queen's flight, 170 people, aircrew in the front row. You may notice towards the left there is one civilian, that's our civilian secretary, but next to him is a Royal Naval officer, and he was one of the helicopter pilots. We always had one Royal Navy helicopter pilot because of the links with the Royal Navy that Prince Philip had, the Prince of Wales had, and Prince Andrew had. But in 1994, there was a review, Lord Pocock's review of royal and communication flying. It came out with the idea that the Queen's flight needed to be expanded, and 2 of the 125s from Norfolk should move to Benson. The Ministry of Defence then uttered the immortal words, "We think we can do it cheaper." So the net result was the Queen's flight was disbanded on the 31st of March 1995, much against the royal family's wishes. And the following day, a date not lost on some of us cynics, number 32 Squadron became overnight number 32, the Royal Squadron. The 3 146s, 2 Wessex helicopters joined the 6 125s already at Norfolk. If we go back to this picture, the front row, the aircrew went over, but only 6 engineers, 4 policemen and 4 operations staff. The rest went back into the Air Force, and that's where they thought, the MOD thought they would make the savings. The civilian company providing engineering at Norfolk, I think it was Serco, they expected to get 80 of our engineers. They got 6, because what they hadn't based on was the fact that the cost of housing around Ruislip versus the housing around Witney, where most of our guys lived, was just totally different, and there was no way they could buy. So they were lucky in the fact that British Aerospace were just closing Hatfield, and 1 or 2 of the engineers from there didn't want to move to Manchester, so they came down to Northolt and worked on the 146. So they were lucky they got some very experienced engineers in to help. It was mentioned earlier, the joining at Norfolk, seamless. I would describe that first year, because there were 2 very serious incidents, neither of them with the royal family on board, I'm glad to say, but I described it with the analogy of the swan. It may have looked serene on the surface, but there was a bloody lot had been going on underneath. The aircraft we gained, the 125, if you think of the 146 as the Jaguar, this was the MG sports car. A lovely little executive jet, quite small, quite tight in the cockpit as well. There's the galley. It was a 8-inch square sink, a hot tap and a cold tap. So if they wanted a meal, it had to be a salad. And in the cabin, that door led to the loo, so there was no privacy. The Royals didn't have a separate cabin or anything. So it was decided in general that the male members would use it. For instance, if the Duke of Kent wanted to go to Manchester with his private secretary and policeman to open a factory, the 125 was perfect. Speeds were very similar to the 146. But if he wanted to go to Germany to see his 2 regiments that were based there and take his military ADC, possibly one of the former commanding officers and his baggage master and so forth, there was no way they'd get all the baggage and the people in the aircraft. So the 146 was used for that. It was a worldwide operation, and in my 20 years, the only places I didn't go to were New Zealand and parts of Australia. I landed in Darwin, and parts of Canada. I didn't go to the west coast of Canada. The reason for that, of course, is that the Royal Australian Air Force, or Qantas, were allowed to fly the royal family. Canadian Armed Forces, or Air Canada, and the Royal New Zealand Air Force and Air New Zealand. In fact, Her Majesty went out to New Zealand when they actually took over the upper cabin of a 747, and she flew out to New Zealand on a scheduled flight. The longer range flights by the Royal Air Force were normally done by another aircraft, and we would go out to the final destination and do all the internal flying to the small airfields that the larger aircraft couldn't go. So back in the 60s, it was the Comet 2s of 216 Squadron, and then the 70s, the VC-10s of 10 Squadron based at Bryce Norton. But after that, once the VC-10 was really kicked out because of its noise and the huge fuel bill that it was filling, it was over to getting charter flights. And normally it was with BA. So the 767, 777s were the ones. They did use Concorde as well on a few occasions, but nowadays, civil charter is the way they go for not only the long range stuff, but a lot of the internal stuff. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about overseas tours that we did. Once it was decided we were going to do an overseas tour, the operations staff would start booking the airfields, the refueling, the handling agents, the hotels and so forth, and all the diplomatic clearances, which took up a lot of time. Only SACs and corporals doing it. They did a wonderful job. I'm going to pick one particular tour here. It was obviously to East Africa. We started down in Mozambique, then went through Zambia, up through Tanzania, and then on to Somalia, Djibouti, and then finished up in Sudan and in the western, the western side of Sudan. And this was the area it was in the news back in the 80s, and it's still in the news today, of course. And I'm going to start with showing you an arrival, a royal arrival at an upcountry airfield. No state arrival with 21-gun salutes and so forth. Excuse me. It's a very small arrival situation. It was at a place called Mbeya, and there it is, and I see about 12 people lined up to meet the Princess Royal. But there was a lot of noise and cheering and shouting and dancing, and the kids had their own band as well. It was a lovely, warm arrival. And behind the princess, you can see what I call the mamas in their national costume, and they literally shriek the arrival. It was absolutely lovely. The other one I'm going to look at is Zilingi, which is up on the border with Chad. And we needed to get in there because the princess wanted to go to a Save the Children refugee camp right on the Chad border. We flew into Niala, but we couldn't find anything about Zilingi. So we asked their air attaché. He couldn't tell us anything because he was actually living in Kenya. But we decided to charter an aircraft, and we were doing a recce flight around the whole route, and we took the royal household with us because they needed to go around as well. So we chartered the Save the Children aircraft to fly into Zelinghi, and there it is. And they said, you'll be parked under that first tree on the left-hand side. Anyway, when we landed, there were quite a lot of large stones, and the Andover does tend to pick them up and it damages the propeller. So we asked them if they could clear that. And they said, oh, yes, we can do that. And I said, could you also put some painted white stones across the threshold and down the side of the runway? Because if the visibility isn't as good as it was that day, then it might be a bit of a problem. So they said, yes, we can do that. And just as we were about to leave, the plan was we were going to stay on the ground for 4 hours while she drove to the camp, and once she was safely there, we would depart for Nyala. And anyway, just as we were about to leave, he said, there were still dissidents in this area. Would you like an armed guard? So I said, yes, please. And I told the policeman when he came back, he said, oh, that's good. So now roll on 6 weeks and we're on our royal arrival. And you might be able to see the Save the Children aircraft had already landed, and the captain, who was a British Britannia co-pilot on secondment, he was acting as our air traffic because there was no air traffic there. And I noticed there were 2 white stones either side, so they'd done a bit of that, but we were looking for the security. We were looking for a tank or a Land Rover with a Bren gun trailer. Couldn't find anything, and I was just about to land when the co-pilot said, oh, I spotted something. Now, I don't know whether you can see that here, but I'll blow it up. It was actually a guy on horseback, and he'd got a Lee Enfield 303 rifle over his shoulder. And anyway, they'd landed, so did we, and we parked up under our tree. And if you notice, the princess is in the middle of that, being met by Save the Children Fund, the local council, and some security guys. There's one guy looking the other way. That's her protection officer doing his job, looking in case there were people coming in from behind. After they left, we wandered around. I'm not going to complain about the spelling of welcome because I can't read the Arabic script above. But there's the guy. He rode round. We were only on the ground for 3.5 hours as it happened, but after 2 hours, that dog arrived and just followed the horse around. But anyway, we were able to leave after 3.5 hours. The problem is when you depart on a strip like this, when you start the engines, that happens, and it doesn't matter what they're dressed like, they get covered in sand. The other things on a recce flight we look at is air traffic control. Can we understand them? Can they understand us? So we normally visit air traffic. Refueling. If we wanted fuel, and very often when you're landing on a rough strip, you need to pick up fuel. We just say to Shell UK, on such and such a day, at such and such a airstrip, we need so much fuel. And bless them, they never let us down. It normally arrived in 45-gallon drums on the back of a lorry. And if you refuel from 45-gallon drums, you need something called a woggle pump. And to fill an Andover, it took 5 hours. To fill a 146, 9 hours. But in fact, doing that, we tried wherever possible to just pick up the minimum amount of fuel we needed. The other thing for safety we needed to check was the fire cover. And as you can see here, he was very proud of it. He said it was British and it was built in 1831. Well, it wasn't, but it did have a thing on the side saying Pyrene, manufacturers of fire equipment since 1831. But I noticed one small problem. It had only got 1 wheel. So I said to him, where's the other wheel? He said, oh, it's on the Land Rover. So I asked the supplementary and found out they'd only got 5 wheels. So a couple of days later, we spoke to the High Commission when we got back to Dar es Salaam, and a couple of days later, the British Council delivered them 2 new Land Rover wheels. So they had a spare and a spare on both vehicles and enough to put on the fire engine. And when we went back, it had had another coat of paint as well. But it's not enough fire coverage, you probably gather, for a royal flight. So we had to have an airfield tender driven from Dar es Salaam. It took us 2 hours to fly. It took them 4 days to drive there. Had they not arrived, the trip would have been cancelled on safety grounds. Now, a quick run through a few more things. The flags I showed you on that strip in Ethiopia, that's actually... That one there was the Duke of Edinburgh's flag, and there's the flag store at RAF Northolt. And I promised you a picture of the Wessex helicopter. There it is, going in 1998. after it was delivered in 68, and I will guarantee you it looked better that day than the day it was delivered by Westlands. Our engineers, I show that as testament to our engineers. And if you want to see it today, that particular one is in opposite the Wessex Cafe at the Royal Air Force Museum, just down the road at Hendon. Now, the Queen's helicopter flight, I've just noticed one thing I should have changed, because it has been changed. It is now the King's helicopter flight, and it's based at RAF Odium. Initially it was at Blackbush, but they moved to Odium. The crew and staff are members of the royal household, because there was no RAF helicopter suitable to replace the Wessex. So Her Majesty, they actually lease from Sikorsky. The first one was for the first 10 years, and then this is the second one, which they've now had for 2 years. And it's a lovely aircraft. It flies a lot faster than the Wessex. So instead of saying the helicopters only went as far north of Birmingham, now they can fly up to Newcastle just as quick as you can fixed wing. It's in use a lot, and they also charter an Augusta 109. There is talk of them getting a second helicopter, but I don't know whether anything has happened with that. As I mentioned before, nowadays a lot of the royal flying is done by private charter, and this was a state arrival of Her Majesty going into Berlin in 2015. It's an Embraer Legacy, and there you can see the captain holding the Royal Standard out of the front window. Now, the following day they were going to Frankfurt, and Her Majesty wanted to take some of her household staff, a lot of presents and so forth. So this aircraft was too small. So the Germans said, "Well, we'll lend you an aircraft." It was an Airbus A340, which could take 500 people. But that little Legacy was in use when the Prince and Princess of Wales, or as the Cambridges, went to Poland a couple of years ago. There it is, Golf Tango Hotel Foxtrot Charlie. Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, of course. It's Lord Levy's personal aircraft, and when he's not using it, he allows it to be chartered. The Royal Air Force does some long-range flying with the Voyager. This is, again, the Duke of Cambridge landing in Amman. It's now been repainted with this rather gaudy VIP fit, which I think Boris had a lot to do with. And the government actually have got an Airbus A321. It's operated by Titan Airways, but they have 30 to 50 seats on 12 hours notice throughout the month. And it's used by the Prime Minister and ministers. It hasn't been used to date by the royals. Now, just before I finish, I got a favourite destination, and it's in the Hindu Kush in Pakistan, and it's a place called Chitral. I've been in there about half a dozen times. First time back in 1969 in a Mark 1 Andover, but with the royals I've been in about 5 times. And you fly over a 10,000-foot mountain, drop into the valley, which is 5,000 feet above sea level. That mountain in the distance, Mount Tirishmir, is 25,290 feet high. It's the very western end of the Himalaya. And as you get further down the valley towards Chitral, you start looking for the runway. We thought we could see it, but that was actually the river. But anyway, it's right in the top centre position is the actual airstrip. And if you come the other way, that's looking down the valley. You can see it's about 45 degrees off the runway direction. And as you backtrack, there is that hill with the local commander's house on, and literally you then throw it right and land. What we call an exciting arrival. I was due to take the Princess of Wales in there, and we were flying her from Peshawar, and the idea was for her to have lunch on board on the 40-minute flight, but there was bad weather, it was low cloud. It was forecast to clear at 2 o'clock. We scheduled in at 1, so I said to her, "We'll eat on board on the ground at Peshawar, and then we'll try and get in." She said, "Oh, I don't mind if we go back to Islamabad." And I said, "I think you'll regret it. It's a lovely place." And this was the first view she had, and I think you'll agree it's a pretty amazing looking place. We said to her, "You must be back on time though, please, because we've got to get out of that valley before it gets dark." And bless her, she came back 10 minutes early, and we were able to have a crew photograph. And she said, "Can these 4 kids be in it?" And I said, "Of course they can. Who are they?" She said, "I don't know, but aren't they lovely?" So we had that. Now, my other memorable trip. You were probably watching television, particularly at 7 o'clock in the evening. It was the 31st of August 1997 when I flew the body of the Princess back from Paris Villa-Coublay, taking off into a golden sunset and arriving back at Norfolk. And that was one doors time that we did make absolutely to the second. And I was so pleased that we were able to do it for her. And after that, I flew back up to Norfolk, flew back up to Aberdeen with the Prince so he could go back to the children. Joe, myself and the kids went up on the Monday and put our flowers in row 2 and then went back on the Thursday when this photo was taken. Could not believe it, to sign the Book of Condolence. Well, the 146 left service last year, and just a couple of photographs. That was the final in March. The final, we had a sunset ceremony, and they were able to get a fly pass. As you imagine, Heathrow's about 3 miles behind us, and so it must have done a fairly sharp turn after it passed over the hangar. But it then took off later in March, a week later, on its final sortie, and there it is leaving ZE 700, leaving Norfolk for the very last time, and it finishes up at St Athan for the South Wales Aviation Museum. 701 went back earlier to Duxford, and it's out on the line of their outside aircraft, and I had a look at it a few months ago. But replacing it now is the Dassault Falcon 900, which they've named the Envoy 4. And of course, the Envoy was the first publicly funded aircraft. So we've gone sort of full circle, and it's got the Prince of Wales, the King's new crest on there. Sadly, yesterday when he flew to Belfast City, he was back using civilian aircraft, one of Lux Aviation's Embraers. But he has flown the Envoy, and so have some other members of the royal family. So we're hoping that the 32, the Royal Squadron, will be back to flying Royals, because they did very little over their last 5 years. And the very last photograph I'm going to show is my last trip with the Prince of Wales, when he presented me with a wonderful colour photograph of him in Royal Air Force uniform, which was signed, and a wonderful set of Asprey silver cufflinks with his crest on, which sadly was lost in a robbery at our house some 2 years later. But there we are, the history of royal flying. Hope you've enjoyed listening. Thank you.
Really enjoyed that.
Any questions? So we start with questions from here. Anybody? One in the back there.
Yeah, mentioned about Harry and Andrew for helicopter to think. I remember reading the paper about 12 years ago when it was, one of the officers said Prince Harry does not have the aptitude to be an Apache pilot. I've met a couple of army guys, and one guy said, "Oh yeah, he's a great guy," and that he was trained to be an Apache pilot at a different pace to others because he had royal duties to do. Another guy said, "Well, he's not doing it the straight pace to the other army guys because he's not quite intellectually good enough for what should have been." So I don't know if you know anything about this, but also Andrew was known nickname for in the papers, Air Miles Andy. I remember 10, 12 years ago, people said, "Oh, it cost me a fortune to go buy commercial helicopter up to the Midlands and back, and he should have gone by car, basically." But I don't know why as far as I'm aware, he doesn't fly helicopters so much in the last few years. I don't know why that is exactly, but I don't know, maybe if you know anything about this.
The answer is no, I don't. I have flown him on occasions, and I have flown him up to Lucas, which is quite close to a well-known golf course, and he was actually going up to watch the Open. However, he also went up, which the dear British press didn't bother to talk. He did 2 other engagements that day before he went to the Gulf. And the other one, I've no idea about the army, what the Army Air Corps thought of Harry as a helicopter pilot. All I do know is he did go out to Afghanistan and operate, but to what ability. I never flew. Well, I did fly him 3 times when he was a young boy, but I've never heard anyone talk about his flying abilities. All I will say is that the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Edinburgh, who I did fly, they were both very good pilots. Okay, and any more? One in the front.
Yes, they went in with the envoy, and when the envoy joined the Royal Flight, I've read somewhere that the envoy was designed by the author Neville Shute. Have you heard that yourself?
Yes, it was. He was working. This is the original envoy, not the latest one. The original envoy. He was working for SV at Portsmouth, and he was involved with the design of the envoy. And sometimes I mention that. Sometimes I don't.
Well, there was another story back in the 70s at RAF Australian. One of the RAF officers there was not from the School of Fighter Control, but from the Mazor section. He was telling me some story he'd heard. I don't know how true it was, but apparently the Andover was flying the Queen and the Prince Duke of Edinburgh somewhere, and the 2 pilots are sitting there, and then all of a sudden there's somebody comes knocking and looking at the cockpit. It was the Duke of Edinburgh. So as you said, he's a very good pilot, and he was sort of looking around, and obviously the captain knew that he was itching to have a go, and he said, "Would you like to say the word?" Yes. Taking over, the young first officer was sitting there. And he didn't actually know what to say to this very senior royal. So he said, do you think Her Majesty would be going up into the cockpit to have a look around?" Nervously. And Edinburgh sort of thought for a bit, said, "No, I don't really think so." He said, "Mind you, this thing keep me up like a shot."
I've heard that story as well. But what I will say is, in fact, when they flew together, he didn't. When I was on the Queen's Flight, he never flew. He only flew when he was on his own, because he didn't fly when Her Majesty was on board. But he certainly did fly with her, and would come up front. But I don't think he.
I think there's no.
I think it is like a lot of these stories. It's a few years old and it gets better every time.
It's from the early 70s.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't join the flight until 81, but he certainly wasn't flying whenever Her Majesty. Yes, one at the back.
Which aircraft did you enjoy flying the most?
Which aircraft did I enjoy flying the most? If I said I enjoyed operating the Andover, because that was when you were operating it around the world, hot and high, you really had to work at it. And actually flying the 146 was lovely because it had so much power, and it flew almost like a fighter. It really was a very well designed aircraft. Originally, of course, it was designed as a twin engined aircraft, and Rolls hadn't got a twin engine one that was good enough. But I think the Andover for operating and actually physically flying the 146. So I've sort of batted both in the air, but there was a big difference from the two. The 146 you could operate it quite easily everywhere, but the Andover you really had to work at it. Any more from here? Yes. Yes.
Hi, 2 questions from me. So firstly, obviously, given the kind of the global scale of Royal Tours, and you talked a lot about all the different places around the world that you operated, do you know, was there any consideration ever given to a dedicated wide-body aircraft to avoid you having to stop and refuel every 4.5, 5 hours when you were doing these kind of long-range tours? And secondly, why do you think that there's been such a reliance on private biz jets in the last 5 years, and how do you think that might change going forward?
Right. The long-range aircraft, the difficulty is getting one of the size that, I mean, transatlantic for a start you need, but the problem is getting one of the size that will take a royal party. If I say to you, when the King travels on an overseas tour, there is over a ton of baggage in addition to things. Now, in most of the small biz jets, that's going to be a problem. If you had a larger aircraft, that's why the RAeS squadrons, 101 squadron with the Voyager now, tend to do the long range ones because they've got plenty of room and plenty of space, and they can get with a smaller load. Of course, they can get quite a distance, so that works out quite well. But the second question, just remind me.
In terms of why you think there's been such
yeah.
reliance on biz jets?
It's that. It's cheaper, would you believe? The Air Ministry accountants doubled the price of the 146 overnight, and consequently they stopped using it for a lot of the time. And it is cheaper to buy civilian charter aircraft. Having said that, of course, the RAF aircraft have defensive suites built in. The civilian ones, most of them don't. But if you're an accountant, it's just that. And the actual what's going on up in the air, you don't know and you don't care. Sadly, there are only accountants here. Yes, anyone? Before we go around the world.
Go on, I'm going to ask you one.
All right.
It's I remember from my time serving, shortly after the Falklands, I read that you've been detained in Africa, Zimbabwe.
Ah,
Tell us the story, because I'd love to know.
okay. I'll try and do it quickly. We were doing a recce on our way down. I was flying an aircraft. We've been doing a recce for the a Princess Royal trip around southern Africa. It was going to start in Swaziland and then go on to Zimbabwe, Zambia, and then I think we were going to finish up in Somalia. But what happened was that on my way back, we got turned around to go, because the King of Swaziland died, and to pick up, it was the Duke of Gloucester at Harare, and then take him in, and then fly back to UK. So we had less time, and during that time we were away, the Royal Household had come up with the possibility of going into a strip called Aberdeen 2 in the Inyanga area of Zimbabwe, which is on the, get the east-west right, on the eastern side of Zimbabwe, right up against the Mozambique border. And so we said, well, look, what we'll do, we were due to pick her up in Johannesburg. So we said, well, we'll leave a day early and we'll do a recce flight on the way. So we arranged, and it was all cleared by the Air Ministry in Zimbabwe, and we went, landed, and again, it was a bit like Zilingi. It was very bumpy and lots of stones and so forth. And we turned around and taxied in, and I could see an army guy standing there. We knew it was a military strip. And my policeman got out in the normal way, and I saw him standing there. And then the next thing I saw was him get a gun out, his pistol out. So I thought, oh, so leave from the front. So I wandered out. Oh, the co-pilot had already got out. He was desperate for a fag, so he got out and walked up the runway to look at some of these stones. And I looked up, and he was standing chatting to one of the guards, and I saw him offer him a cigarette. They were quite happy. Anyway, I went up to this guy, and he said, "You're not supposed to be here. You've got no clearance." And I said, "Yes, we have." I said, "We've been cleared by the Ministry." "No, you haven't." And he said, "Don't try and depart, because I'll shoot the wheels, shoot the tires out." So, okay. So I went back to the aircraft, and I said to the co-pilot, "See if you can hear any Air Zimbabwe aircraft, preferably with an expatriate on the RT, and tell them what's happened and ask them to pass it on to the defence attaché," which they did. We got a 707 overhead, and they passed it to Harare approach, and about an hour later we got a reply. It was from the RAF air attaché, and it said, "Okay, lads, keep your chins up," which wasn't really what we wanted to hear. But eventually, after about 6 hours,
he came and said, "You've now got clearance to fly back." And what had actually happened was the boss of the Rhodesian, well, the Zimbabwe Air Force, but who was an expat, had planned to take one of their DC-3 gunships airborne. I don't know what would have happened, but luckily the clearance from the Defence Ministry came through, and it was these guys were actually the 5th Brigade, the Mozambique 5th Brigade, who were looking after that part of Inyanga for the Zimbabweans, but not ideal. When we got back to the hotel, I said to the crew, right, you've each got 3 minutes call, which is on the government, and tell your families what's happened. We didn't know whether it will get in the press, and there was something in, I think it was the Sun. This happened on the Wednesday. On the Thursday morning, just a small 5-liner, but on Sunday the story broke big time. We were in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and the headlines in the Sunday Times in there was royal hostages. And when we landed at Swaziland, at their airfield, once the Princess Royal had gone, the British press came storming over and all wanted to know what had gone on. So I just said a full report has been sent to Buckingham Palace, and that was it. I went down to our hotel later that evening, and one of the royal reporters from the Sun, a guy called Harry Arnold, came up with his photographer, a guy called Arthur Edwards, who's a wonderful friend of mine, a wonderful guy, who's still working. And but they came up and said, "Oh, do you want a drink?" And I said, "Yeah." I'd known Arthur for a while, and so I said, "Yes, okay." And Harry started to ask questions, and I didn't even need to answer before his mate said, "No, he's off duty, nothing apart from a drink." So that I had to write a report, and that went back to London, and I recommended we didn't go to Aberdeen too. So we didn't, so I never went again.
Story whizzed around the Air Force within a day.
I bet it did, yeah. Right.
William, can we have a look at the questions from people at home?
3 questions.
Right.
Thank you for the presentation, Graham. It was really, really interesting. I would listen to you for more hours! Exclamation mark. So would I. I love the special firefighting equipment with one wheel. Smiley face. Which aircraft were you flying during your career in the Air Force before TQF? If some people from the audience would have further questions, we can get in touch somehow.
Right. Starting from the front, when I was at school, Combined Cadet Force, we had our own primary glider. So 12 guys on a bungee rope pulled us airborne, and that was my first getting airborne. Then I did a gliding course at Curtin and Lindsay on the Kirby Cadet Mark III. Then I joined the Royal Air Force. I flew the Jet Provost Mark III and Mark IV at Church Fenton. Then the Varsity at Oakington on twin engine training. Then I was posted to the Andover OCU and subsequently to 46 Squadron as a co-pilot on the Andover Mark I, which was brand new in service. And after a tour as a co-pilot, went back through the OCU 2 years later as a captain, and was then posted 4 months after Joe and I got married. I was posted unaccompanied for 13 months to RAeS Sharjah, which was next door to Dubai. And Dubai at that time had 2 hotels with a total number of rooms of 36, and it didn't have an airfield. But it was being built while I was there in 1969 and early 70. Came back, did Central Flying School to learn to become an instructor on the Chipmunk. And after that, I was, when you get into training command, you try and get out as quickly as possible. So you apply for everything. And I applied to go out to Kenya to fly. I can't even remember what it was, but it was just go. Didn't get that job. Then they wanted a VIP Andover captain in Brunei. So I applied for that. And believe it or not, I got it. I then, having been told I was posted there, seconded, well, it was loan service to the Asker Malayu Diraja Brunei, the Royal Brunei Malay Regiment. I then looked up to find out where Brunei was, and it turned out it was in Borneo, so that was rather nice. And after that, came back on the Andover Mark 1 and Mark 2 at 32 Squadron, flying VIP work. Got promoted to squadron leader, went to 115 Squadron on the Andover E3s that did the flight calibration to all the RAF flying stations, home and overseas. And after that, I became the Andover and HS-125 examiner for the Royal Air Force. And one of the units I visited, of course, was the Queen's Flight. And I often think when I was invited for interview in 1981 with 6 others, that I got the job because it was better the devil they know than the ones they don't. So they then flew the Andover until 1986. The middle of 86 changed to the 146, although myself and Prince Philip's personal pilot stayed dual qualified because we still had one Andover. So I did the odd flight and we trained on both types. And then when I moved to left the Queen's Flight when it was disbanded, went to Northolt on the 146 until December 2000 when I retired.
So Ballas, I hope that gives you the answer you wanted. Have you ever thought that that's how you did on varsity? Someone saw these Vikings in the sky and thought, oh, that's almost a Viking.
Well, yes, it was a Viking with a nose wheel. You still had to climb over that large lump of metal in the middle of the fuselage. Which anyone, in fact, anyone who's worked down the back will know that very well.
Right then, one from Lloyd. As a trustee of the Mildenhall Museum, I'm asking for some photographs. Is it possible for you to share 2 of your photographs?
The 2 that I showed on this, I can certainly send in. If
I've got his email
you
address.
got his email, fine, okay.
Can we say the email address?
Yeah.
Gustavo, your question. Thank you so much for sharing such amazing pictures and stories with us. I would like to know, have you ever had any kind of emergency in flight? Any member of the royal family on board? Thank you for your lovely presentation. I loved it.
Right, I know to which he is referring. So we know it as the Islay incident. And I was taking the Prince of Wales from Aberdeen to Islay, not a long trip. And he managed to come up front, not for the takeoff, but for the landing. And we were on the approach. There's fairly visual conditions, everything going quite well. He was a little bit high, but the 146 has got a very good landing performance, so I was entirely happy. And at about 400 feet, he said, "Are we okay?" And I said, "Yes, land." And he did. I took over the controls and pushed the stick forward as I normally did. In fact, I didn't realise that he was actually about 10 knots faster, and maybe been a little bit more. And when I pushed the stick forward, it meant, unbeknown to us, the main wheels lifted off the ground. So consequently, with the brakes on, they weren't actually doing much. And when they did come down, the tyres burst on the starboard side, so that cut down the braking. And I'd taken over control once I realised things weren't right, and I was almost standing up in the seat braking. The nose wheel went off paved surface and was pushed back. The main wheel stayed on the runway, so it was literally the reason the nose wheel broke is because I now know that the end of Islay runway is a peat bog. If it had been Aberdeen, I think we would have probably just went damn and taxied off to the terminal. But alas, we did. The paper said £1 million worth of damage. And guess who was sent back to Islay to fly it back undercarriage down to Benson once Crash and Smash had done their work? But I've got one picture which I half guess this might be the story, but the recovery off the runway was a very green one, as you can see, with Clydesdales rather than tractors. So I haven't, I don't think the Prince of Wales has seen, or sorry, the King has seen this one, but I will send it to him probably. This was 1994, so I think in 2024 I might send him this one. But yes, it was. They'd actually got the local farmers to just come over one field, and they did, all the guys that were helping set this one up. But I thought it was quite an amusing photograph.
Were there any other lesser incidents, Graham?
Lesser incidents.
Well, that's an accident.
Incidents, let me think. There must be. But I was thinking of that one in particular. Yeah, we had our the odd moment. Turbulence was one thing that I remember. I had the Princess of Wales down the back on a trip back from the Iguazu Falls to Rio, and we were due to land at Santos Dumont Airfield, which was the inner city airfield as against the international. And we were looking on the radar, and we thought we could see the hills slightly to the east of Rio town, where that famous statue of Christ is on the hill. And we thought that was it, but it turned out that was actually part of a storm. And as we flew into the storm, the turbulence was the worst I've ever encountered. And so I just said to the trafficker, can we turn right 90 degrees? Because that was going to take us over the sea, and we knew that was a better chance of the turbulence lessening. During that operation, while I was busy up front, apparently the group captain, who was the deputy captain, went into the royal cabin and said, you know, please make sure you're well strapped in. But the turbulence was so bad, he did it on his hands and knees, and apparently pulled the curtain back and just said to the princess, can you make sure you're well strapped in? And she just fell about laughing, you know. But it was a very funny up front, I can tell you. But we then decided to divert and go to the international airport, and the following day we left the aircraft there overnight, and the following day took off from there to go up to northern Brazil. But I wrote to the air attaché in Brazil, the defence attaché, we didn't have an air attaché, the defence attaché, and said to him, could you pass on to the Director of Civil Aviation our thanks to the controller who was on approach at the time. And about 4 months later, I got a lovely letter from this girl in sort of Brazilian English to say how honoured she was to have used work for the flight, and thanking me for the letter. And I thought it was nice that it got back to her, because she did a really good job. And it wasn't only me, there was a Lufthansa aircraft struggling at the same time, you know. So it really was, you know, it was certainly the worst turbulence I've ever come across. That's all the stories I'm giving anyway.
Excellent.
Any more?
Last question from Tone. It's from Matan, who asks, when was the last time the Royals visited Bhutan? What was the aircraft in use? BA 146-100 was for Royal Bhutan Airlines, or a more recent one. Similar to the mountain approach you've shown us already, are there any special certificates for this flight? Mountain flying certificate? Question mark. I've only been in Bhutan once, and the approach to Paro is one of unique from those I've experienced as a passenger. Terrifying, yeah.
Right, Bhutan. I was due to take the Prince of Wales into Bhutan, but the trip got cancelled. But Bhutan Airways certainly had 146s, and I know there is I don't know what they use now. I have a feeling they use 737s now, but there is a rather nice film on Google, if you care to watch, of the approach into Bhutan. It's almost a continuous turn, and again, it's a very mountainous area, and it needs to be. And again, it's rather like Hong Kong was, where you had to have practice going into Kai Tak in the old days. I'm showing my age. Yeah, I've not been into the new one, but when I was in Brunei, we used to do a lot of training at Flight Act, which was lovely. They used to let us do our training. So when we trained a couple of the Brunei co-pilots, we took them to Hong Kong for a week, and the controllers were actually quite keen because it was at the time, back in 1974, when they were just fitting the IGS system onto the runway, that the one with the big turn on. And that really effectively meant you had a localizer to follow, but not the glide path, but there was a DME which gave you distance. And then you could go with that, you were allowed to go lower than the original twin NDB approach that was used. Well, you've probably all seen photographs taken of people's washing with a 747 go at about 10 feet above it. And it was, you know, when you actually did it regularly, it wasn't as frightening as it appeared. But I must admit, I was a little bit worried when I first went in there. But I've done it in both the Andover and the 146.
As
Right.
cabin crew, we used to love sitting on the flight deck going into that. I did it many times.
Any more from the house before we finish? No? Okay, so we've got to the end. I hope you all enjoyed our celebration of the month of the coronation. It's something that we've pushed in by design. We got you here specially for the month, and it's just so lucky we've got you on our doorstep. Graham, that was a real insight into royal flying.
As a serving Air Force person, you've seen the Queen's flight lots of times, and it's just something you see and think, great. Now, what goes on there? I really would like to know. You've given us some idea, but I'm sure there's a lot more to it. And
There is, and I hope that there will be a King's flight. But I spoke to the King about a month ago at Windsor when I met him, and sadly, I think much as he would like it, it's that. So whether they will, I think he may well do more flying with the Royal Air Force, because he does. I know he prefers to fly with the Royal Air Force, but I think he's bound by cost, the same as we all are. But it will be a pity if it does disappear, because I think the Royal Air Force should fly our monarch.
you asked a question earlier, and I'm going to expand on it a little bit. One of my ambitions for next year is to get Ian, the new OC of 32, the Royal Squadron, to come and talk to us about what happens today in detail. I'm intrigued to know what goes on today. So I want to take the story beyond Graham's into 32 Squadron, new CO. How have you found it? What does it do? Tell us all about it. Watch for that. I'm pushing to get that next year. Okay, Graham, I know you could have talked a hell of a lot longer, and I wish you had, quite honestly, because I'd just love to know more. I'm going to say thank you very much for giving up your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you for giving up your time free. We are in a position now where we don't charge any subscriptions. All the people you see haven't paid anything to come and see you. We have no formal paid membership.
No, good.
We expect the Aeronautical Society to fund us to continue educating the local population. You are local, and you're a resource that the locals ought to use. Thanks ever so much. To all the rest of you that are here tonight, thanks for giving up your time. Thanks for coming to listen. I'm really impressed how many people are here. This COVID, post-COVID, isn't a sudden boom. We've had this since COVID finished. People have rushed back, straight back. Thanks ever so much for coming. Everyone at home, thanks ever so much for being at home. You've missed out on not being here. You've missed the atmosphere, but thanks ever so much. And that's it. I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. Joe, thank you for coming. Graham, thank you for accompanying your wife, doing whatever it is you've done, but thank you. Good night all. See you next time.
Thank you.